This is a CBS News special report. I'm Norah O'Donnell in Washington, and we are coming on the air because the war in Ukraine has begun.
The Russian president says a military operation is now underway in eastern Ukraine.
Starting in the city of Kiev, there has been reports of explosions.
And you can see what Ukrainian officials say is a column of Russian armor crossing into Ukrainian territory from the north.
Сегодня я инициировал телефонный разговор с президентом Российской Федерации. Результат – тишина.
These are among the darkest hours for Europe since the end of World War II.
No one is coming to defend Ukraine.
Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences.
The United States has announced $700 million worth of new military aid for Ukraine.
The scourge of the Black Sea, now buried at the bottom of it.
It indicates that the Russian armed forces simply aren't up to snuff in terms of modern military capabilities.
Ukrainian flags are flying again in Kherson after the country's troops entered and liberated the city.
Yes, the Russians are out of Kherson city, but they haven't gone far. They are just on the opposite side of that bank, and they're using that position to fire rounds into the city daily.
Even though the city is in artillery range, President Zelensky arrived for a victory lap of Central Square.
Protesters in Melitopol stared down Russian military vehicles. So as Russian forces bombard city after city, the Ukrainians, they are refusing to give up.
Russian troops pulled out of the town of Bucha, about an hour outside Kyiv, at the end of March.
In Bucha, blood still stains the streets. This is what they left behind on Yablonitska Street. The bodies of several men shot to death, hands tied behind their backs. Further down, this person was shot to death on their bicycle, and another, and another, and another, and another, and another.
In a forest on the edge of Izium, the ultimate dehumanization, unmarked graves.
More than 440 bodies have been found, most believed to be Ukrainian civilians, many with their hands and feet tied, most with evidence of violent deaths.
We were a human shield. We could see that. We could see that clearly as they were shooting back and forth.
The villagers were packed so tightly in the basement, 11 of its more frail residents didn't survive the month-long ordeal.
And new Russian attacks on civilians tonight, just one day after those missiles struck a central city, killing at least 23 people, including 3 children. One of them, 4-year-old Liza, seen in this video shortly before that attack. Her stroller seen afterward at the scene.
Many people will die. Many civilians will lose their homes. Many villages will be destroyed.
Всі ми тут, наші військові тут, громадяни суспільства тут, всі ми тут захищаємо нашу незалежність. Слава Україні!
In late February of 2022, Vladimir Putin and the Russian Federation escalated an 8-year ongoing conflict with Ukraine by moving invasion forces into the Donbass region under the guise of a special operation of forced denazification. Since then, the death toll has been massive. While it is impossible to know for sure at this time, the United Nations reports that a minimum of 16,631 civilians have been killed or injured, while unconfirmed casualties are estimated to be much higher. In addition to this, many cities have been relentlessly bombed by Russian forces. The destruction has resulted in not only the loss of life and home, but of history as well. Sanctions against Russia have been hard-hitting and widespread. Many architects have joined in to disavow this needless war. Firms including BIG, OMA, MVRDV, and many others have all ceased development of projects in Russia and refused to continue work in the country until the war is ended. While this at face value is a good thing, it is difficult to grasp why now these firms have taken the opportunity to speak out against violence and oppression, when many of them have and still do participate in it elsewhere. In truth, architecture has always had issues when it comes to exploitation. Like many fields, unpaid internships are still a problem, with 40% of interns going unpaid across all industries. And even within those that do pay, workplace culture and wages are still a topic of debate. Expectations of how much work one is expected to give can be overbearing. Overtime is the rule rather than the exception. Even in school, studio classes come with an expectation that you will be pulling all-nighters at some point. But these topics are a separate issue from what I'd like to discuss here. Symptoms of a systematic problem, rather than one confined to the field of architecture. The more pertinent issue is the inseparable connection to the elite. The proclivity to work for the wealthy isn't all that surprising. The arts, being a result of culture with an excess of resources, naturally lends itself to those with large, disposable incomes. With the large overhead buildings have, even when not hiring an architect, this issue is only intensified. The poor cannot afford to build suitable housing on their own, so it is no surprise that the only clients architects attract are those with wealth. There is historical precedent for this too. For time immemorial, architects came from and worked for aristocratic families. Every famous Italian villa, French maison, German Schloss, English manor, and Japanese shiro came from noble benefactors. The only major exception to this was religious institutions. Even so, the historic power of the church and its massive influence is clear from even a cursory glance at St. Peter's Basilica. The only major difference was that these churches were designed under the pretense of benefiting the community. The over-the-top ornamentation and scale was designed to show the power of the church, yes, but it was still serving its congregation. There was a time where the cultural hub of European cities was tied not to museums or city halls, but the location of its cathedrals and guild halls. When Louis XIV commissioned the sprawling grounds of Versailles, there was little benefit to anyone that wasn't tied to the king. Its cultural impact cannot be understated, but that impact was only felt by those connected to the king, and by those who came long after his death. There is, however, one thing that these palaces provided to the commoner, and that was housing. Although it was limited based on the number of servants they had, the larger the palace, the larger the staff. In the case of Versailles, at one point, around 1,500 servants lived in the palace, with many more living in nearby towns. The conditions that these people lived in varied from poor but adequate to barely livable. It is clear that the needs of servants were not taken into account in the designs, and were only a consideration when they might have been seen by the masters of the house. In fact, hallways were invented so that servants could travel from room to room without bumping into anyone but other members of the staff. In-house servants stayed in common practice until the early 20th century. Even some early Frank Lloyd Wright houses included separate rooms for maids, cooks, and wet nurses. This all began to change midway through the 20th century when technology reduced the overall need for servants.
So true, Mrs. Doughty. In your Frigidaire cold pantry, there's a place for all your foods. Fresh and frozen, canned, bottled, and wrapped, new bought and leftover.
For those that still desired them, public transit meant that it was now possible for them to commute. Rather than having to keep the help in your house, you could have them live in poor ghettos and only come around when you needed them. Architects went from providing rooms for the disenfranchised out of necessity to being able to ignore them altogether. Perhaps it was for the best. Rarely would servants be provided with more than the bare minimum, if even that. In many cases, living outside the home meant more room and freedom to do as you pleased away from the watchful eye of the lord of the home. But the continual poor conditions of their new homes, as there was no longer anyone who needed it to look presentable, as well as the meager living that they earned, meant that the options for doing as they pleased were still extremely limited. Is it better to be provided with the bare minimum, or to live with nothing of your own accord? As globalization and democracy began to overtake isolationism and monarchy, architects went from building for the merchants and nobles to providing designs for the government and corporations. This has its ups and downs. It obviously depends on the type of government. After World War I, modernism began to emerge as an alternative to the perceived empirical nature of local monumental architecture. One place that saw this happen was the relatively young country of Italy. With its people newly unified under tumultuous circumstances, the rise of the National Fascist Party was an inevitability. Giuseppe Terragni was a radical follower of both modernism and the Duce. His most well-known built project was the Fascist Party headquarters, but he designed many other projects for the party as well. Not all of these projects would be realized, however. In fact, there was one project delayed by the German invasion of Europe that was an absolute loss for architecture. The Danteum was a project explicitly designed for design's sake. Far beyond a simple statue or plaque, the building celebrated the poet Dante as one of Italy's greatest writers. Despite it being steeped in references to the Fascist Party, it still stood as a seminal work for Terragni. This project shows that his design sensibilities were separate from his political affiliations. His allegiance to what would ultimately prove to be a violent and dictatorial leader was an example of misplaced faith. And he isn't the first, nor will he be the last. Philip Johnson, along with many Americans, admired the Nazi Party before their atrocities and warmongering were revealed. Johnson's transgression is forgiven by some due to his helping modernists such as Mies van der Rohe escape persecution. But for others, it is simply another in a long line of architects seduced by authoritarian power. All regimes need someone to architectualize their goals. For the Nazis, that person was Albert Speer. He oversaw the redesign of Berlin into the Welthauptstadt Germania for the Nazi Party. His designs were powerful. With minimal neoclassical designs exaggerated to their extreme, there was no better way for the Nazis to punctuate their domination of the world. Fortunately, it was not to be.
The tribunal finds that Speer is not guilty on counts 1 and 2, but is guilty under counts 3 and 4.
At the Nuremberg trials, Speer was sentenced to just 20 years imprisonment, avoiding a death sentence by claiming ignorance of the Holocaust. It was only long after his release that it was discovered that this was a lie.
Reconnaît-il certains des visiteurs du camp de Mauthausen?
Père.
This shirking of responsibility is not uncommon among architects. Kenzo Tange and Kisho Kurokawa worked with many Middle Eastern dictators in the 70s. Heatherwick Studio, even after 4 suicides, shows continued resistance to compromising the design of the vessel in New York City. Zaha Hadid's Heydar Aliyev Center in Azerbaijan, a country that ranks 154th on the World Press Freedom Index, required almost 250 forced evictions of residents to be built.
Это было ночью, мы спали, и вдруг резко почувствовали, я спала с детьми, я почувствовала, что дом трясется. Просто был резкий удар. Они ковшом бульдозера стали ломать стену моих соседей.
Over 500 workers, many of whom were questionably contracted, died during the construction of Al Janoub Stadium, one built for the World Cup in Qatar, another of Hadid's projects. When asked about these deaths, Hadid stated, I have nothing to do with the workers. I think that's an issue the government, if there's a problem, should pick up. It's not my duty as an architect to look at it. But this is a lie. An architect's role encompasses more than the mere design of a structure. It is also our job to oversee the construction and ensure the safety of anyone involved during and after. Any deaths are ultimately the responsibility of the people in charge. Shifting the blame only shows gross negligence. It is easy to fall into the mindset of inevitability. Qatar was going to host the World Cup. They were going to build stadiums. Even if that stadium ended up being designed by the Qatari government, it would have been built. And at the end of the day, 500 workers would still likely be dead. It isn't hard to see why there is a defeatist attitude among those designing for oppressors. But as architects, there must be a desire to leave a place better than you found it. Is that not the goal of good design? Why should that desire stop at the physical product? If you have the chance to change a society for the better, even if only for a short time, you should put in the effort to do so. That's the reasoning behind the push for sustainable architecture. There must now be a push for ethical architecture. Worker safety is codified in all of the countries these firms are based in. If you were to ask, these firms would likely state that they don't follow these regulations just because they are laws, but because they, as a principle, are important. There is no reason they should be less important only because your building is half a world away. If these standards were actually followed on principle, then there would be no need for this discussion. Granted, sometimes accidents do occur, especially if consistent oversight is difficult. But these accidents should be taken as a personal failure, rather than an issue the government should pick up. While on one side there are these unfortunate examples, there is another way you can look at it. In January of 2020, Bjarke Ingels was photographed next to Brazil's former far-right president Jair Bolsonaro, a man who has been accused of borrowing propaganda tactics from the Nazi government.
A arte brasileira da próxima década será heróica e será nacional. Será dotada de grande capacidade de envolvimento emocional e será igualmente imperativa, posto que profundamente vinculada às aspirações urgentes do nosso povo. Ou então não será nada.
Ingels had been invited to the country alongside several other architects and designers as a part of the Nomad Group to discuss development of the country's tourism. Many people disapproved of the fact that Ingels would associate himself with the controversial figure. This isn't the first time that Big has been criticized for its business partners. They are often under fire for cooperating with large multinational groups known for their exploitative actions. Rather than claim ignorance or shift blame, Bjarke Ingels owns his collaborations, stating, "As much as I would enjoy working in a bubble where everybody agrees with me, the places that can really benefit from our involvement are the places that are further from the ideals that we already hold." This sentiment is echoed in their first book, Yes is More, released alongside an exhibition of the same name in 2010. They proclaim that the architect's vision often conflicts with the client's desires, especially in the cutthroat world of business. Rather than compromise the design or, God forbid, tell the client no, Ingels sides with the yes men of the world, arguing that complicating a design by implementing often impossible tasks makes the overall project richer. This sentiment is not shared by everyone, and Big still receives a lot of ire for it. Buildings will fail if all they are is a glorified sketch model or a design by committee cube, so this is a sentiment I agree with, at least theoretically. When implemented well, this method can lead to a complete revitalization of an area. Implemented poorly, it leads to gentrification and the increased marginalization of the oppressed groups that were trying to be helped in the first place. Speaking of the oppressed, there are times in which architects try to prop up the lowest common denominator more directly. The main way is through government housing programs. There are many examples of these projects ranging in success, but one of the biggest names in the field today is MVRDV. Starting with their breakout Wozoko housing in 1997, they have since built multifamily housing projects all across Northern Europe. These projects are all iterations on a few connected ideas, all focused on community. Most clearly seen in Silodam, the fragmentation of large blocks of units encourages neighborhoodization and alleviates the faceless mass that many large housing projects take. Utilizing the exterior to create connected circulation as an antithesis to Unate's windowless corridors helps to replicate the streetfront condition. Finally, elevated courtyards create gathering spaces public to the residents but private from the rest of the city. These ideas are an evolution of the traditional apartment block, improving conditions while preserving the essential idea. While there still exist many flaws in the social housing system at its core, improving it as it is much more viable than reinventing it entirely. Although it existed earlier in the form of corporate towns and factory flats, social housing as we know it began following the widespread destruction in World War II. The bombing that took place over much of Europe left millions without homes, and it was up to the local governments to pick up the pieces. The majority of the first attempts at social housing failed for a variety of reasons: infrastructure mishandling, shoddy craftsmanship, poor funding, lack of knowledge regarding this new programming type, and architects focused on theory rather than practice, just to name a few. Even if they failed, these first attempts were all taken with a noble goal in mind. It was purely to provide housing for those who needed it. Later, as economies recovered, more sinister motives took over. Politicians began to wonder, why should we have to deal with sprawling slums when we could concentrate all the problematic communities into one place? The biggest figurehead of this movement was Robert Moses.
Our distinguished guest for this evening is Mr. Robert Moses, the nation's foremost city planner.
Moses was a public official who was most well known for his rapid development of New York City's transportation infrastructure. While the new roadways saw a marked improvement for traffic, it came at the expense of bulldozing communities, most often poor, minority-majority, or crime-stricken.
Of course, to build these roads, you have to move a lot of people's homes, don't you, sir?
Yes, especially in urban communities, in urban and suburban communities. That is one of the big problems.
Could you give us any indication of how many homes will have to be moved in building the New York Thruway?
Well, the New York Thruway is, I would say, 3/4 of it is in open territory where there's no problem. The other 1/4, I wouldn't know how many. But in New York City, on the approaches to the thruway system, there are really two thruways. One goes up to Buffalo and out west, and one goes to New England, goes east into New England through Westchester and Fairfield County, Connecticut. I would say that there are about, on those two approaches, about 10,000 people.
Well,
with the power of eminent domain on his side, Moses demolished unsightly slums and replaced them with new, equally problematic but visually appealing apartments. Commonly known as the projects, they used the latest in architectural social theory to try and discourage crime and consolidate the undesirables. However, it often had the opposite effect, with the wide communal greens becoming dangerous after dark, isolating people in their rooms. Gang activity increased, as the lines delineating turf were clearer than ever.
Anyone that is passing a high-rise project and looking in from the outside, it seemed like a beautiful home, a clean home, and a lovely place to live in. But I live inside of a high-rise in Chicago, and I know the atmosphere that I am living in. Someone would think that living in a high-rise building with its many family that is involved, that you wouldn't be lonely. But I feel living in a high-rise building like this, that you are very much lonely. It makes me feel as if this is not my home. This is only a place where I sleep and pay my rent. It's just like you're closed in a corner with no way out, nowhere to go.
Robert Moses showed little care for the people he displaced, but so too did the architects who built his project housing. Many saw it as an opportunity to leave their mark on the city, while others tried to implement their ideas of good housing without consulting the people who would be forced to live in it.
You must remember that these people have come out of slums. They have brought with them some of the slum-bred ideas. some of the slum-bred hostilities. We don't want to make it so comfortable and so ideal for them that they wish to remain in public housing. We are trying to get them upgraded, if you will, so that they can go out on the open market and find private housing. If I had a choice of living at Robert Taylor Homes or in a dilapidated shack, I would choose Robert Taylor Homes.
When I visit my mother in what some people may call a slum area, I feel this is home. Not because it's my mother's home, but it's because I feel free. I've left behind me the noise. I left behind me the hundreds of children. I left behind me these stone walls closed in on you. When I go there, I can sit on a porch, or my kids can go in the yard and play. I can open a door and walk out and say, don't do this, or come inside and eat. These little small things is really what matters.
Fortunately, things seem to be changing. Recent years have seen a boom in sustainability and adaptive reuse. The LEAD program offers businesses that might otherwise be apathetic to green design a reason to pursue it, with promises of financial savings and good PR. The prestigious Pritzker Prize has seen a shift from awarding the theorists of the high architecture world for their bold designs, to awarding successful executions of local community supporting projects.
You are bolstering my courage for recognizing the architecture I've been doing. This award is not just for me. It is for all those who I met during my life. And it is an award for Burkina Faso. Dear friends, dear heroes, dear family, dear everyone, what are the challenges today? What is our big concern today? Climate crisis is real. Material is limited. If we take everything, it's finito. There is no more. Conflict for resources will intensify everywhere around the world. And population growth is imminent. No matter where we are from, this should concern us.
The most recent winner, Francis Tibero Kere, gained notoriety by executing projects across his home country of Burkina Faso, combining sustainable materials and local building methods with modern spatial theory. This allowed for the construction of several schools in small villages, often in places that didn't have electricity or running water. Other recent winners include Lacatin and Vassal in 2021 and Alejandro Aravena in 2016. Both of these winners were cited for their responsiveness to the local conditions and for the support and empowerment of existing communities. While architecture will always be tied to money and power, the best we can do is put it to good use. And it seems more and more that architects are seizing this opportunity. So, how exactly are architects reacting to the ever-evolving war in Ukraine? And what wider effects will this have on the architecture world? There was the aforementioned termination of projects in Russia by several notable firms, but this could largely be seen as a PR move, the most extreme version of changing a corporate logo. Sure, they may have lost potential income from the cancellation of lucrative projects, but the goodwill they earn will far outweigh it with potential new projects. It is hard to know whether these decisions were spurred on by corporatism or actual concern for the loss of human life. Personally, I imagine it is a little bit of both, and regardless, I feel that not addressing the issue at all would be more heinous. While this move hurts some of the oligarchs funding these projects, it does little to address the humanitarian crisis caused by the war. So, if the cessation of Russian projects isn't doing much to help, what actual solutions are being offered?
The architectural community has a poor record in responding to such crises. For example, my area of practice and research is displacement and the architecture of the refugee crisis, and the architectural and design community has largely failed to respond in a coherent or effective way to this challenge. There were very few architects in Lesbos in 2015, in Calais in 2016, or now in Turkey, working with refugees.
One of the most immediate concerns early on in the conflict was the accommodation of the millions of refugees fleeing the bombing of cities. Understandably, this put an immense amount of strain on the public transportation infrastructure in neighboring nations. Additionally, the processing of refugees meant that bottlenecks would occur around arrival points, with thousands of families being required to spend days inside train stations waiting to find out where they would be able to stay. These train stations are not equipped to house so many people for such a long period of time, and the lack of privacy creates more distress on top of the already terrible situation.
This is what happened in Japan 2 years ago in northern Japan. After the earthquake and tsunami, people have to be evacuated in the big roof like gymnasium. But look at this, it's no privacy. People suffer mentally and physically. So we went to there to build the partitions with all the student volunteers with paper tube, just a very simple shelter out of tube frame and the curtain.
In order to help give these families a semblance of housing and privacy, Shigeru Ban and the Voluntary Architects Network has been using Ban's paper partition system, housing hundreds of refugee families in Poland with the help of students in Warsaw and Wrocław. The temporary screening system was originally developed during the Rwandan Civil War and was last used in 2011 after the Great East Japan earthquake, and uses recycled materials, in this case donated cardboard tubes and fabric from local Polish factories. The partitions are set up in a flexible grid to fill already existing railway stations, supermarkets, and gymnasiums. This helped to alleviate the stressors on cities experiencing a mass influx of refugees during the first months of the war by allowing for the conversion of existing spaces into temporary housing. One place you might not expect to find support for Ukraine would be Russia. However, it is important to remember that the people of Russia are not the same as the government. Many Russian cultural figures have spoken out against the bloodshed, including those in art and architecture. Over 6,500 designers signed an anonymous letter condemning the war. This letter has since been removed due to new laws banning condemnation of the war. Groups such as the Strelka Institute, VAC Foundation, and the Tretyakov Galleries have all spoken out with their support for the cessation of all hostilities. Several galleries have shut their doors and removed installations in response. Their actual emotions, whatever they may be, must unfortunately be filtered through a narrow lens of vague condemnation of conflict in general. Any direct attack against the Russian Federation would likely be met with censorship or arrests, just as has happened with other protesters. For example, an image of the apotheosis of war had to be posted in black and white, as the colors of the original painting might have been interpreted as showing support for Ukraine.
Я просто хотела спросить, как вы думаете, если здесь просто сказать два слова, меня за это сейчас арестуют или нет?
Вас уже задерживают.
It is a fine line that the people of Russia must walk if they wished for their voices to be heard.
Было много вопросов по поводу новостроек Мариуполя. Где они, что с ними. Ну и мы приехали в один из самых знаменитых, я бы сказала, самый узнаваемый новый район Мариуполя. Он называется Невский. Ну, здесь, конечно, дорого-богато, все очень красиво, дома такие хорошенькие, их много, стройка продолжается, и люди уже начали заселяться в квартиры.
Ну, открою вам секрет. На 4-м этаже в 28-й квартире установили лопнутый сливной бачок. Дали неделю назад воду. Постепенно вода накапливалась в 24-й квартире, пока то есть 28-й квартире, извините, 28-й квартире, пока не нашла себе дорогу и не налилась на 3-й этаж и на 2-й этаж. На 3-м этаже и на 2-м этаже на подвесные потолки в районе пола.
Ну починят, обещали, нет? Что?
Нет пока ничего. Никто. Мы не можем найти пока концов. Нас посылают к какому-то Ване, который бригадир потолочников.
Теперь, конечно, спасибо большое за все. Мы благодарны. Мы благодарны этой России, что помогли, что дали нам квартиру.
At this point, the nation is still an active war zone, so reconstruction efforts are limited. But there has been one fairly innovative proposed solution. WZMH has developed a system designed to work with what is left, rather than raise what hasn't already been leveled by Russia. Their system is called SpeedStack. It is designed to be fully modular, with units able to literally plug into one another. Each block is prefabricated off-site and installed as needed. The system is uniquely adapted to the Soviet Khrushchevka housing typology. These blocks were constructed with structural facades, which makes repair work very difficult. It does, however, make the structures very sturdy, to the point where individual units can still be used even after the partial destruction of entire sections of the building. This new approach is drawn from a similar problem Japan faced after the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. However, where Japan faced a tabula rasa, Ukraine's cities still stand in many respects. The metabolist ideas of renewal and modularity are found in WZMH's proposal, with a modern application and new design constraints. There is the potential that with this system, towns could see fast renewal without completely replacing the home that its people knew. Not all propositions have been met with universal approval, though.
Приветствую вас из города-героя Харькова.
Kharkiv's mayor, Ihor Terekov, met with Norman Foster, offering him the opportunity to produce a master plan for Kharkiv's reconstruction. This was an offer made outside the work of the UN for Kharkiv task force, set up by the UN to help organize humanitarian efforts. Foster put out a short manifesto declaring that he would, quote, assemble the best minds for reconstruction. While Foster was unofficially involved with UN for Kharkiv as a consultant, this statement implied that Foster had little confidence in the task force's abilities. This was the source of some backlash, but it may have also had something to do with the architect's reputation for city design. Foster's work on the Reichstag sparked criticism from those who preferred more traditional styles, and from historic preservation groups.
There's a confluence, there's a convergence of desires here. Advocacy that might come from those of us who are more remote, rebuilding the destroyed heritage, statement of the architects group, a transport report from the past to improve the quality of public spaces, and the mayor of Kharkiv, who later in that process identified the potential for a monument to the war. So moving into a time of victory, a building that would freeze for future generations the memories of the conflict and would be a public building. And he said the Reichstag that you were responsible for with your team and the politicians in Berlin, that could be a model for that, and appropriately identified as the potential for a Ukrainian version of that in the future, the regional headquarters on Freedom Square.
But I feel that the most cited reason is the lack of input from Ukrainian architects. Now, it is entirely possible that when plans begin to be put in motion, local expertise will be consulted, but the impression given when the announcement was made was one of abandonment.
Here is one working session, and without reading the fine print, if you do, you'll see that the United Nations are there, foundation members, representatives of the council, representatives of the Kharkiv architects.
Rather than seek solidarity and strength from within, Terekov sought the help of an outsider, one whose name was more important than their knowledge of the city.
I knew nothing about the city other than I might find out from a Google search.
Perhaps the sentiment would have been better accepted if Foster had been a member of the UN support group, or if he had reached out unprompted, or if Terekov had asked for general support and input. But by reaching out to someone uninvolved with the existing aid efforts and asking for their support specifically, it gives the impression that there is a lack of faith with the systems in place.
It shows a good mood of our mayor and our government who invited Norman Foster. And another one is attention to Ukraine, especially to the Kharkiv. It's very important from side of big names. But we also have to be aware about during the war after colonization, we could go to other intellectual colonization.
Oleg Drostov, the founder of the Kharkiv School of Architecture, has warned of the potential of intellectual colonization as outsiders coalesce to support Ukraine. The total number of Ukrainian architects and designers are far outweighed by those who are offering support.
Who and why should be involved in the discussion and in the process of reconstruction? Especially in this situation, it's very important to be more open and to involve as much as possible local actors of the process. And first of all, it's local community, also experts, also artists, so different actors who live here, who know the situation, and who actually have voices.
There is a danger that incoming architects who seek to help will end up erasing Ukrainian culture by implementing the ideas that have been cultivated in their own nations. Much of Ukraine has been seeking to westernize ever since it became independent from the Soviet Union, but the Ukrainian people must be able to do this at their own rate and on their own time. To force change, even unintentionally, could be as dangerous to their culture as the bombs that Russia is dropping. Until the war ends, it will be difficult to know exactly how the world will be changed by the devastation. But we have witnessed the strength of the Ukrainian people, and there is no doubt that they will rebuild if given the chance. The world is ripe for a new paradigm shift, and this very well may be the spark that ignites it. There are many cultural similarities between today and the interwar period. During this time period, the arts saw the seeds sown for a shift away from tradition, facilitated by the rise of new technologies and globalization.
A fascination, I think we could say generally, with the new. New was a catchword, the new architecture or the new housing or the new man, the new woman.
The world wars were the perfect catalyst to see that change assimilated elsewhere. The widespread destruction and elevated public connection to the developments of the world meant that new ideas were needed and were able to spread quickly. We are fortunate that the war, as of yet, has not spread beyond the original two belligerents, but that doesn't mean that it cannot result in global change. The past 30 years have seen a massive change in technology with the rise of the home computer and the internet. Powerful parametric design tools have allowed firms to create radical new forms never before thought possible. This mirrors the rise of the automobile and assembly lines, which led to the machine aesthetic in groups like the Deutscher Werkbund, Soviet Constructivism, and the Bauhaus School. These groups all produced rationalized geometric buildings stripped of most ornamentation, all made from factory-produced parts. The standardization of a building's components lowered the cost of construction, while technological innovations like Mies van der Rohe's curtain wall allowed for exteriors to become practically invisible. These styles were still somewhat evolved from the Art Nouveau movement that came before it, but instead of utilizing structural advancements to attempt to create a more naturalistic style integrated into the roots of the building, these styles used the same technology to reduce the presence of a building to its absolute minimum, allowing the structure to seep into the building's outward expression. The links between Gaudi and Brehens may seem scant at first, but it only takes one look at Erich Mendelssohn's expressionist Einstein Tower to see the through line. Even though these styles can be connected, it doesn't change the fact that the separation between them is far wider than the preceding changes in the field. Technology alone is not enough to explain this change. It took the horrors of war ravaging the land to push so many to look ahead to what was possible and develop it. Formally, we are at a similar tipping point. The work of people like Zaha Hadid, Sana, and Sui Fujimoto prove that today's technology has the potential to radically shift our conception of building. Deconstructivism has taken hold in a similar vein as the constructivism before it. But formal changes are superficial at best, a result of larger shifts in the cultural zeitgeist. The post-war era saw many changes: the rise of the middle class, socialism, and the general liberalization of society at large. These sentiments were an overcorrection to the blatant atrocities committed by fascism and seeped into the very core of the public, and would continue to build in the following decades, much to the chagrin of some. In America, the results can be seen in the prosperous 50s, leading to changes such as the civil rights movement and the negative public reaction to the Vietnam War. Architecturally, it saw the general acceptance of modernism and the international style. After the short-lived popularity of brutalism, a swath of avant-garde movements attempted to reinvigorate the field. Superstudio, metabolism, supergraphics, archigram. But the infeasibility of such projects meant that such radicalism had finally lost its steam in favor of more realistic endeavors, and innovation returned to the safer, more affordable edifices erected in the decades prior, and a slower, steadier development cycle began anew. Large shifts wouldn't be seen again until the computer-aided designs of the second half of the 90s. Today's society is similarly volatile. Civil unrest and political radicalism have grown in many places that were thought to have been stable and thriving. The world is almost at a precipice, and it just takes one last push to step up and over the edge into the unknown. And we know that this is true. The global pandemic has already caused a massive change in workplace culture. The open office planning structure that had been simmering for many years has required a major re-examination, as work from home has shown to be a viable option for many. But how likely is the war in Ukraine to have far-reaching effects similar to those witnessed in the post-war era? In truth, unless Russia escalates the war to a global conflict, the changes we will see will not be as extreme. World War II had such a massive impact because the entire world had a part to play. With the exception of the Ukrainians and Russians, as well as a few neighboring nations, the threat of destruction in the face of Russia's corrupt government is not there. There are certainly individuals around the world who feel deeply affected and have the will to make changes, but the broader public has and will continue to gradually lose interest, especially with the help of the modern 24-hour news cycle. The lack of direct involvement means that focus on the flaws inherent in our current way of thinking will be allowed to fester until the next catastrophe illuminates them for another brief moment. But I don't want to sound too pessimistic here. The fact that there are those who quite literally must adapt or die means that changes will occur, just on a smaller scale. Additionally, the fact that there are those who are not experiencing such perils but are attempting to find answers to the same problems means that we will see changes occurring faster, as they do not have to wait until the dust has settled to begin formulating solutions. The big takeaway is that things are changing for the better. Architecture's wealth and power-dominated history is slowly crumbling as the social responsibility of architects continues to grow more significant. The number of people speaking out against anti-humanist urban design continues to grow, and those who have the ability to improve the built condition are starting to listen. There will be pushback, as there always is, but momentum is on the side of change. Russia's violent outburst is the symptomatic death throw of an antiquated hierarchy, and while architecture will continue to struggle against the stranglehold of the rich and powerful, designs will only continue to improve the lived experiences of those who inhabit them. If you made it all the way to the end, I just want to say thank you. This video has been in the works for almost a year at this point. I've struggled a lot with how best to characterize the war in Ukraine without pretending to know more than I actually do. My background is not in geopolitics, so my ability to commentate on the actual circumstances of the war was limited. Even in an hour-long video, I still feel like I've barely scratched the surface with many of the things I've discussed. If you have any opinions on any of the topics I brought up, feel free to leave a comment below. I read all of them and would love to continue the discussion. As a final note, I have left several links in the description for charities that I believe are worth donating to. If you have the money, I ask that you consider supporting the humanitarian effort. Until next time, have a good one.